This episode is brought to you by Buffalo Trace Distillery. Powerful yet smooth. Contained but never tame. Proudly going their own way, but never going alone. This is the spirit inside Buffalo Trace Bourbon. Made at Buffalo Trace Distillery, the world's most award-winning distillery. Buffalo Trace is always perfectly untamed. Distilled, aged, and bottled by Buffalo Trace Distillery, Franklin County, Kentucky. 90 proof, 45% alcohol by volume. Learn more at buffalotracedistillery.com. Please drink responsibly.
We see you getting after your fitness goals. But what about those money goals? You can count on Credit Karma for a clear view of your finances and your progress, helping you see results so you can keep checking off those financial personal bests and find your way to money. Progress never felt so good. Download the Intuit Credit Karma app and start achieving your money goals today. Intuit Credit Karma. Karma you can count on.
I'll wait until you get all your bits and then work my part out, if you like. And, you know, it's like that. It's like a matter of working it out with you while you're working your bit out. You know, if you got your base bit.
Look, you know, you're doing it as though I'm trying to say that. And what we said the other day, you know, I'm not trying to get you. Well, really, I'm trying to just say, look, lads, the band, you know, should we try it like this, you know?
It's funny that Harry Benning, because when we
It's like, should we play guitar all through Hey Jude? Well, I don't think we should.
Yeah, okay, well, I don't mind. I'll play, you know, whatever you want me to play. Or I won't play at all if you don't want me to play. You know, whatever it is that will please you, I'll do it. But I don't think you really know what that one is.
Hello and welcome to episode 254 of Something About the Beatles. And this features returning guest Glenn Greenberg, who you may remember from the three previous shows. The first was Dear Friend. It was an examination of the post-1970 relations between John and Paul. And then we did one on a post-1970 tracks that might have made up a collective Beatle project. And most recently, last summer, we did on the 80th birthday of Brian Wilson, a Brian Wilson and Paul McCartney discussion. Those are three shows you may remember him from. And in Beatle world, he's responsible for a number of bookazine, magabook projects. He's done first on John Lennon for the 80th commemoration of his birthday. Then there was one for the 80th of Paul back last June. There is an upcoming one that should be out any moment now. That is a Beatles quiz book. Loads of pictures and great graphics and such. So lots of cool fun stuff, and I'll let him speak for himself about the next Beatle-themed project. But he's also big in the Marvel world as well. Glenn Greenberg, look him up. Anyway, it is not quite February as the show is dropping, but it is the birthday month of George in February. And we'd done the India show at the beginning of the year with Susan Shumsky, which if you haven't checked it out yet, do check it out, and especially her book, The Inner Light. But this is a discussion that earlier in the previous iteration of a show, I think we sort of come at it, and honestly, there's not a topic that was ever done on a show that's not worth a revisit, and so it is with this and with Glenn and I, the relationship between George and Paul through the years, but most particularly end of the Beatles into the solo years and through the death of George. It's something that, neither one of us are professional psychologists, so we can only speculate with what we know and stick to what we know as much as possible and try to draw conclusions from that. So it's not just pulling stuff out of the air, but hopefully providing little nuggets of insight here and there, because honestly, of all the inter-band member relations within the Beatles, I think it is the most complex, possibly, but certainly the most mysterious in its way. I mean, if you're a Beatle fan, longtime Beatle fan, pay attention to things, you will know exactly what we're talking about. So that's what we're doing here. I can tip my hand a little bit that upcoming shows, we've got a revisit to the Get Back film. After that, we haven't really done much, if anything, on the recordings of Ringo solo. We've talked about his drumming quite a bit on the show, multi-part episodes, but this is the 50th anniversary year of the Ringo album, And I thought, who better to have on to discuss it, the making of it, than somebody who was there and played a key part. Not only played a key part, but was name-checked both visually and sonically on the album, which is pretty cool. You've got that to look forward to, hopefully. Anyway, I will get out of the way, and we will proceed with Glenn Greenberg and myself discussing Paul and George. McCartney Harrison. It's complicated. All right, so to this point, you have done a bookazine, I think is the preferred term, on John and on Paul.
Yep.
And you've got at least a couple others in the pipeline. Am I correct?
You are correct. The next one, which comes out at the end of January, the title, as far as I know, it may change between now and then, but right now the title is The Book of Beatles Trivia. It was a lot of fun to put together. We've got chapters on each of the eras in Beatle history. Mm-hmm. And then we've got a chapter about each separate Beatle. And then we've got a chapter about the solo years. So it's not broken down into 9 chapters, 9 questions each. The cool thing is it's not a quiz. It's not like multiple choice or anything like that. It is questions that I guess I kind of curated, ranging from, they're real simple. I mean, you could answer some of this stuff in your sleep.
What's Paul's first name?
But I tried to get a little esoteric for the more hardcore fans so that they get something out of it too.
Mm-hmm. Does this follow the template of the earlier publications where it's like a bookazine with great graphics?
Oh, yes. Yeah. It's very photo driven, some great photos in there. But the questions, it's pretty straightforward questions. But instead of like one word or yes or no or true or false kind of things, I do have the space to get into like paragraphs, or I can give a little bit more context, some historical information, a little bit of additional trivia. So it's a fun format. And like I said, it goes from who was the Beatles' first drummer to which former Beatles is involved with the film Son of Dracula, which is probably as obscure as you can get. Because I don't know how many people out there know about Son of Dracula other than the one with Lon Chaney Jr.
Right.
So there's another one out there, and it's got an interesting backstory.
Yes,
and an interesting Beatles connection. So that's coming out at the end of January. And I've got another one, which I'm not sure I can at least announce yet, but it ties in with more or less the story of the making of a certain Beatles album, which is going to be having an anniversary in 2023. So people out there listening can do your research and maybe you'll figure it out.
Yes. Okay. Well, in theory, every year is an anniversary year, but we'll go to 5-year increments.
You can do that.
Yeah, or 10-year increments. As we know, historically, the friendship between George and Paul is the oldest friendship in the Beatles.
Right.
Predating the Beatles. I mean, John and Paul didn't officially meet till 1957, and Ringo after that, they met him when they crossed paths in Hamburg and Liverpool. But those two had a friendship preceding them making music together, although they were doing it independently.
Right.
And it seems like a lifelong source of irritation to George was Paul sort of casually tossing out in interviews, well, I'm 18 months older than him and something like that. It was actually half that.
Right.
But would have been great up in school. And that stuff is a lot more magnified when you're that young than obviously it is as an adult. But pulling rank seemed to be a thing that Paul was never one to shy away from. So.
That's putting it pretty accurately, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. So given their closeness that they had, and Paul was the one that brought him into the group and it changed his life. But it seems very peculiar as we look at the last years of the group where John is, and maybe it's a little bit overstated, but not by much, how much he sits out the days they're recording George's songs. And once he's with Yoko, and George has said this much, that when they took acid together, those were the first two, however unwittingly, it brought them closer together and he felt a strong bond with John. But once Yoko entered the scene, that started to fade away. But he said every time I saw John after that, that connection was still there. It just was sort of, blocked, as it were. But past a certain point, the connection with Paul definitely builds to a point of open resentment. You've got the battle over Hey Jude and the arrangement of that. As Paul, the number one Beatles fan, is getting more dictatorial. Again, that's a historic fact. This is not character assassination. It just is what it is in terms of him being more controlling about the arrangements of his songs, which now we have in the open view, the conversation between him and John in the Get Back film after George's walkout. So we know that that was definitely an issue that was sort of simmering in the background. Of course, there's added weight given to that vignette that was in the Let It Be film. I'll play whatever you want me to play because it was in the film. But seeing the context around it, it was not this major turning point that leads him directly to leave the band days later. We know that now.
Mm-hmm.
So, but it is interesting that he had this resentment of Paul that he seemed to hold on to well into the solo years, at least on a musical level, that if he should have had a grievance with anybody, it should have been John, right? Who never saw him as an equal, tended to be condescending and patronizing, even to the end of his days, dismissing George early on as he was just a groupie who followed me around, had this hero worship of me, to which George would respond, I think the two of them misread me in terms of how he saw them, and went on to say they were too busy being John and Paul to notice anybody else being around. So where do we begin to unpack this this fracture in the relationship, which as early as, 69 or 70, when he writes Run of the Mill, that is explicitly, and he has said as much in Miami Mine, about the breakdown of the friendship.
Where do we begin? Well, if we do it historically or we do it in broadly and why this breakdown happened, like you said, if there was anybody that he should have held a lingering grudge against and not been so forgiving about, especially in public and giving interviews and such, you would think it would have been John. I've always suspected that, although George denied it, his hero worship of John never went away. And no matter what, you know, there are people in your life that they can do things to you over and over and over again, and you keep coming back for more because you love them or you honor them or you respect them. I suspect that that was the case for George where it came to John. And it's also almost kind of like John played the distant lover almost kind of thing, where the more he pulls back, the more George wanted him. Because John certainly pulled back more than Paul did. Like, as you mentioned, there were recording sessions for George's songs where John just didn't show up. Now, granted, in some cases, he had been in a car accident and he was recovering. But
or he might not have needed on an Indian track or something.
Right. But there are other tracks that he just didn't show up. Whereas Paul, not only did he show up, but he made significant contributions.
Right.
The more I got into researching the Beatles and their recordings and the relationships and so forth, I got to learn just how involved Paul was in George's songs. And yet George found a way to resent that too.
So I wish I had the psychological training to understand what is that about, that you resent the person that's helpful.
Yeah.
And I know that is a thing. It seems like people are the most resentful of the people that loan them money or something. It sounds like a debt is owed and you resent them for that, even though they gave you what you needed when you needed it.
Exactly. So clearly there are things that we know about George that he bristled about. The whole 9-month thing, which led to one of my favorite lines from the anthology, which I watched again when I first started doing all this research for all these Beatles publications that I've been writing, where he says, Paul was 9 months older than me. And today he's still 9 months older than me, which is a great line. Yeah.
And you get that little bit of resentment still that he recognizes Paul playing that, you know.
But you know, the thing is, with the Get Back documentary, which was very eye-opening for me and a little bit off-putting as well, where it came to George, because I remember as I watched each episode, I would go on Facebook and not post in real time, but just post thoughts as they came to me as I was watching each 3-hour episode. But what really struck me was just how negative George was almost from the start. And the way he was kind of trying to assert himself and present himself as someone with equal voice. And I understand why he felt the need to do that, because he wasn't being treated like an equal. But the way he was standing up aggressively, especially, there was one point where Paul was talking about the fact that they're being filmed for this documentary. And Paul cited a problem that they might have in converting the film from one format to another.
Mm-hmm.
And George just kind of gives him this look like, what the hell are you talking about? And he just goes after Paul so aggressively. I was kind of taken aback by it.
It should have been done on 35 millimeters, which is just the best quality. We shot this on 16 because it's a television picture.
I think we should blow it up to 35. And if they don't take it, they're fucking fools.
Yeah.
Because they're not going to get anything else, are they?
Unless we've got incredible quality on this, 16 going to 35 is a mess.
No, it's not.
Generally, well, they've
There's
got
certain stock that blows up better.
Yeah.
Octagon 500.
Yeah, this will blow up all right, this film.
Yeah.
Now, hearing it on a bootleg audio tape is one thing, but to see the expression on his face and to see the arrogance and the disdain, the look on his face, like, you think you know everything, you don't know anything, and I'm going to show that to you and put you in your place. It reminded me very much of a quote that I read from George when he, Paul, and Ringo went back in for the anthology, and they were going to be working on Free as a Bird and Real Love. And George said something to the effect of, this was like 1994. He said something to the effect of, well, without John here, someone has to call out the bullshit when it happens. Meaning Paul. Yeah. Meaning Paul trying to dominate the proceedings. And that George felt it was his duty to be the one to stand up to Paul and not let Paul get his way every step of the way. And I was brought back to that quote as I was watching Get Back. It seemed like that was, you see, what he was trying to do there to a certain extent, really assert himself. That's what was caught on camera. Now, obviously, we know there was some kind of thing that, or maybe we don't, maybe all of that was BS, that there was something that went down between George and John the day that George quit the Beatles, because as we saw in Get Back, they're reading the article about the supposed fist fight between them, and they're laughing about it. They're thinking of suing. So maybe everything that we've thought for all these years was completely wrong. Maybe he and John got along swimmingly during Get Back.
It's a tough thing to psychoanalyze stuff at this far removed with people you don't know and haven't met, and all you have is the tapes left behind. I know that with Get Back, and I say this with greatest respect for what Peter Jackson did. He made a beautiful film that made people want to watch it, that moved you emotionally throughout. He's a filmmaker. He's not a documentary maker, and therefore I think he was less beholden to getting to the core truth narrative of everything going on. And there were definitely omissions of stuff that through the Nagras we know happened.
For sure.
That were maybe important things to really show what was caught on tape that get into their heads a little bit. And exactly to your point of George basically coming in there with an attitude, a lot of pushback and negativity. On the one hand, he's got all this material. He's feeling refreshed. He's feeling good from being bolstered by people he respected in the States, Dylan and the members of the band, coming back, as he said at the time. Then it was the same old situation back with John and Paul in London, them not giving me the time of day.
The winter of discontent.
100%. So we get that being an instant turnoff, although God knows he tries. It's like a half a dozen songs that end up on All Things Must Pass. He floats at various times, as well as other things like Window that don't get recorded. So part of his resentment and disdain could be from bossy Paul. Not that Paul's out of line being the guy who's got to keep the project on track and keep these guys motivated. He's doing what needs to be done at that moment, and that's the role that he doesn't want for himself. But it's kind of thrust upon him. And George coming off as sort of adolescent, and I'm going to be resentful of any authority at this point.
Exactly.
So you've got that. You've got him feeling not accorded respect for his songs, although, as you correctly pointed out, Paul would be the one to work on them. George himself had said in that one interview, he'd work like a pig on your stuff after he did 10 of his songs first. And that's true enough. But at the same time, you've got what's going on behind the scenes, not at Twickenham, his marital discord at home.
Right.
You've got whatever might be going on with him health-wise, because we know as soon as the session's wrapped, he went and had his tonsils taken out. That might have been a physical discomfort during the time. And you've absolutely got, and we have much more evidence of this on the Nagras than you see in the Get Back film, of his resentment of Yoko being John's mouthpiece.
Right.
And he's already a diminished partner in the Beatles, but now she's sort of ascending through the third chair. He's absolutely going to push back on that till finally he reaches his breaking point.
Right. I was specifically referring to this supposed fist fight.
Yeah. And so if that was a thing, it seemed to me in watching Get Back, it's one thing, like you say, reading the words and hearing the audio. It's another thing to see their faces.
Yeah.
I thought it was an ostentatious display of papering over a real conflict. It was so over the top. Just there's cameras in the room, everything's being filmed. They don't know what form it's going to take, but they have every reason to think it's going to be out soon.
Right.
Because that was what was announced. And they want to keep their dirty laundry from the public.
Right.
So that's what it seemed to me. It seemed unnatural. So to me, where there's smoke, there's fire. I wasn't there. Although there is a quote floating around somewhere that George Martin said that there had been a fight and that they covered it up.
But he wasn't there. That was the key thing.
Right.
That's what's so frustrating. If only he was there.
but there were dozens of witnesses, presumably, film crew, studio crew, and all that stuff. So somebody is not talking. So either it did happen or it didn't. We don't know it this far removed, but it just seemed like they were being awfully protective about something. So be that as it may, it's the resentment of Paul that we're here addressing. And so fast forward, he's got all these great songs. I don't think anybody would argue All Things Must Pass, Isn't It a Pity, Let It Down.
Here's the thing. We know Paul said this directly in front of George, if not necessarily to George, in that September 69 meeting.
That's where I was going.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. No,
Sorry.
go ahead. Finish the thought.
If Paul genuinely didn't think that George's songs were all that good up until that point, September 69, then you can understand why Paul would be more focused on his own stuff. And yes, then make time for George. But if he's feeling that the stuff that George is bringing to the table at that particular moment in time, we're talking Get Back sessions, are not as good and are not that added value that's going to be a key part of the album, you could see why Paul would be focused on the stuff that he thinks is going to sell that album, rather than the token stuff that they kind of do as a nice gesture to George.
A pat on the head.
Yeah, exactly. Because it would be one thing if Paul was just kind of taking John aside and saying, George's stuff isn't really that good, but he's saying it right to George. Right. Up until now, I didn't think your stuff was all that good.
Yeah. And George's response is perfect. He goes, well, that's a myth because most of these songs I wrote years ago.
Right. But again, in trying to get into their various perspectives and see where, because it's easy to just bash Paul. You didn't know what you had when you had it. If he genuinely did not like those songs, how do you judge him for that?
Exactly. And I'm not trying to make Paul out the villain here at all.
No.
I'm trying to present George's point of view where if you believe in yourself, you've just gotten a bunch of validation from people that you admire that are telling you you're a rock star. You are an artist. You've got these unbelievably great songs and you're a great guitar player, all this stuff. It seems funny, bizarre to us from our perspective as Beatle fans, where we accept them all. We recognize them as talent. We know how much they move us and how brilliant we think they are. That fast forward 5 years, 1974, and he's doing the round of interviews for Dark Horse, and he talks about Paul ruining him as a guitar player and saying more, I couldn't tell if I was any good or not, that he needed people like Clapton to tell him he was good. And by the way, so's your wife. but that Paul's opinion mattered that much to him. That does it speak to the dynamic of being in the role of baby brother, as Paul liked to call him? Were you that insecure in your own position as an artist, maybe because from day one you've been in the shadow of Lennon and McCartney? I don't know what that speaks to, that he had plenty of people outside the band to validate him, to make him feel respected in what his proper place was. I don't know. But if you were looking for something to point to as evidence that there was something very broken about their relationship and that Paul carried this extra amount of sway that other people apparently didn't when it came to telling him what his talents were, that's pretty amazing to me.
Yeah, I agree.
Especially when you think, if I was George and if I had a less wounded feeling by what Paul McCartney's opinion was of me, maybe I would push back and say, well, look who you're working with. You really think they're better than me? Pointing to the people in and out of Wings to that point. You could have had me, and that's what you got. I don't think it's quantifiable. I think it speaks to something psychological about the amount of power he was willing to allow Paul to have to impact him.
And he did the same with John, but in different ways.
In different ways, yeah. He sought John's approval, which he never got, really.
Right. That's very true.
Yeah.
That's very true.
The lover backing away, as you described. Yeah.
Yeah. Whereas Paul, to a certain extent, did give him praise, at least publicly, but it didn't seem to cut a lot of ice with him.
Mm-hmm.
That's 1974 interview that you cited. It really was a weird comment to make, as was, 78, 79, where he said, I'd be in a band with John Lennon again in a heartbeat. Or was that 74?
That was also 74,
That was also 74.
Yeah. He praises Willie Weeks at McCartney's expense as a bass player.
Exactly. And not long ago, I read Paul's reaction to that. And you can hear the hurt. It's in print, but you can hear the hurt, but also the bewilderment. Like, what did I do to this guy? Could anything I have done to this guy been so terrible? He seemed to honestly not know exactly what he did to engender this kind of resentment.
I do see it as a blind spot that I don't think he genuinely meant to inflict pain, but that he was oblivious to the reaction he drew by his years of being in the studio with George.
Makes me wonder, was it that Paul was that bad, or was it that George was that sensitive?
Well, clearly he was sensitive.
Yeah.
We know that, and we also know that, as other people have pointed out, the toll of their fame, what it exacted on him as an introvert in an extrovert's business. The whole of Beatlemania. If he could have made a living being the guitarist in the band that did well enough to stay afloat, minus the pressures of fame and just the relentless public grabbing at you physically and symbolically, that you were driven to seek refuge. You try acid after trying pot and drink before that. And then you go to this other extreme of meditation and Hare Krishna. Krishna was a new thing. I think it dates to 66 or something like that. So it was a relatively new bandwagon to jump on when he jumped on it. And the demands of it, if you are a serious practitioner, are so harsh. And it seemed like he shared that with John when John was looking for whatever fix there was for his ailments. He would always go to the extreme, macrobiotic or primal scream therapy, whatever it was that was the most demanding thing. And he wouldn't stay with it. He'd back away before he completed it, of course, in John's case. But George seemed to gravitate toward it, embrace it. He would proselytize on it beyond the point of anybody wanting to hear it anymore, but then would run in the other direction privately, would have these relapses, if you will, in terms of the illicit pursuits and the womanizing and all that stuff.
Right.
Very much some people would say, well, it's the Pisces fish going two opposite directions at the same time. It's a very curious thing, though, that given his negative reaction to fame, and Olivia has said that she thought he had a PTSD from Beatlemania. Tom Petty has said much the same thing about George. Tom's example was, if you slammed a car door within earshot of George, he would jump out of his skin.
Wow.
Yeah. So it's clear it psychologically impacted him profoundly in a way that a Paul was very comfortable with it, or at least reached an accommodation. I mean, he was going back to Liverpool, someone always wanting to be inclusive and have an audience. Can the same thing be said of George? I don't think so, because I think that he would be content making music for himself. He didn't need the crowd, even a small group sitting before him, to be satisfied. That's my read. I don't know if that's accurate or if you look at it differently, but therein lies a difference between them.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that could be a major source of tension between them, just the different approaches to it, to fame and the adulation and so forth. It's funny because the last Beatles book that I wrote, the trivia book, when I was going through it, just finding random bits and pieces, and I finally sat down because I think one of the things that I wrote in the trivia book was about the song Not Guilty. Now, I've heard Not Guilty a million times since I first got the bootleg and then it appeared on the anthology and everything. But it wasn't until working on this book that I actually sat down and analyzed the lyrics and looked into it and saw just how much of a response it was to John and Paul, in the sense that he felt that they were blaming him for getting them involved in India and the Maharishi, which blew up in their faces, and also for wanting his piece of the pie, so to speak.
Uh-huh.
I just want my piece of the pie, and I'm not guilty for leading you astray on the road to Mandalay. And I never thought about it. I just kind of like accepted it as a song.
Yeah.
But when I actually analyzed lyrics, this is a guy who is really on the defensive.
Totally. And I wonder if it's an accident that track was cut from the White Album when John and Paul are sequencing things, absent George and Ringo. Well, we don't need this one.
I kind of allude to that in the book.
Yeah.
That it might have been felt to be a little too personal, a little too on the nose in terms of the interband dynamics. Yeah. But again, the fact that in the 70s, and I do remember there being an interview that George gave in the later 70s, 76 or 79, it might have been with Crawdaddy, I can't remember. He was still publicly taking pot shots at Paul. And again, at that point, he had gone to see Wings in concert. And he kept stressing that on a personal level, they were fine, but it was a professional level. And then he would start really kind of sticking the shiv
right.
in his side. It makes me curious. What did he think he was accomplishing by that? This is a guy who wants to not deal with the press to begin with. Mm-hmm. And by putting all this stuff out there, what did he think he was accomplishing other than bewildering Paul and hurting his feelings, which he was apparently doing?
Sure. I wonder if it's, again, a characteristic thing going back that we see the evidence of earlier on in the 60s, where I'm going to take you down a peg because you're getting a little too big for your britches. Right. And here's Paul riding this wave of unbelievable post-Beatles success, right. On his way to 1979, being recognized by Guinness as the most successful songwriter of, I don't know if it's the century or whatever it was, but
history.
Adulation upon adulation. Mm-hmm. And here's George that I got to take this guy down. He's getting a little too big here, swollen head and all that stuff. So that's the only thing I can reason out as a reason for doing that, because it certainly doesn't reflect well on him.
Right.
That pettiness is not a good look on you, George, especially being Mr. Holy Man and all. So it is interesting that for the guy that espoused spirituality as much as he did, that this is very much in the material world here. But that said, in terms of a personal friendship, you do see the evidence of that here and there. In the midst of the follow-up to All Things Must Pass, Living in the Material World, it drops 1 month after Red Rose Speedway. Right. Red Rose Speedway's got that blurb on the back cover about the Wings Fun Club, right away to this address on the back of the cover. So what does he do in his packaging for Material World, which is a pretty heavy album, in terms of, there's no real lightness on it, not to speak of, but the Jim Keltner Fun Club send a dressed elephant too, blah, 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 blah. Uh-huh. So he's pulling Paul's chain there playfully, lightly. And then was it early 75 after the Venus and Mars sessions wrap, the sessions that John was nearly a part of, so he got reined back in. But Paul has that party on the Queen Mary in Long Beach. And not only does George and Olivia attend, there's that great photo of them embracing. Yeah. Very publicly. I don't think George was given to play acting for effect. I think that if that happened, it was genuine, and there it is caught on film. And it speaks to they're willing to socialize with each other and be supportive of each other. Anecdotally, there's a story of when he was busted in Japan that George and Olivia were the first to send him a telegram pledging their love and support. Yep. So that part does seem real. But as you say, given a microphone and a reporter and enough time to take shots at Paul, he didn't hold back.
Yeah. And again, it was being a younger brother. I kind of recognize some of this behavior that no matter how old you get and no matter what you accomplish, in your older siblings' eyes, you're always going to seem like the younger, inexperienced, know-nothing kid. Yeah. And one of the examples of that is when Paul made Give My Regards to Broad Street. And I don't think it's unfair to say it was a disaster. Right.
Paul concur.
If he'll even acknowledge it exists.
Right. What are you talking about?
But there was an interview with George, and who by that point had already executive produced several films. Mm-hmm. And he said something along the lines of, and I've been trying to find this interview for months now, and I cannot find it, but it was on YouTube, and I know it was there because I watched it many times, but I can't rediscover it. But he basically said I've only been in the film business for however many years it was at that point.
Mm-hmm.
This is George talking.
Yeah.
I've put together films, several at this point. You would think that maybe Paul would give me a call and ask me for some advice, but no, he felt he had to do it all by himself. He had to write the script. And there was another interview that I did find where he said that Paul's biggest mistake was trying to do it all on his own.
Mm-hmm.
And that you cannot make a film all on your own.
For the last few years, I've said my mind to him, just whenever I felt something like, thing like Broad Street, I thought was a big mistake. Not to make the film, because I quite enjoyed it myself, but the idea of trying to write and do everything yourself, that's the mistake.
But the key thing is look at what I've done. Why didn't you call me for advice?
I could have helped you.
I could have helped you, and you chose not to call me. You are not acknowledging that I have more experience and more knowledge than you in this area. And I get that. I totally get that. It's a desire for respect and acknowledgement because you have gone out and you have proven yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And this guy is sort of now treading into your arena. Mm-hmm. And the smartest thing you can do, especially if you really want to get on this guy's good side, is kind of kiss the ring a little bit.
Sure.
And the fact that he brought all this public,
it
was just oozing to me. And again, I know I'm playing armchair psychologist here, but I know I'm right. You know what I mean?
That's right. I see this dynamic in my own family. Yeah. Absolutely. There's got to be a universality to this. Like, why didn't you call me? I do this stuff. You just made a disaster you didn't need to make because you wouldn't pick up the phone.
Right. Yeah. Exactly.
It's funny you bring up that Broad Street one. I had not heard that one, but the one I did hear was, I believe, when they were doing Anthology and they were shopping for a director for that. And Paul took it upon himself to write to all these A-list directors saying, give me in 500 words why you should be the one to do this project. Mm-hmm. And George is like, no, stop. You're not doing that. This is not how it works in filmmaking. Mm-hmm. Okay? So it's funny that, once again, Paul goes off on his own in something that is not in his arena, but it is in George's, and needs to be reeled back by George. Or in that case, he was reeled back, not the first time.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
That spoke volumes to me. And what it gave me what I feel is a pretty accurate insight into at least some of the dynamic. Mm-hmm. This is all stuff that I prepared for the Time Magazine book about Paul. Mm-hmm. And it was all the stuff that I had to cut out.
Yeah.
there just wasn't room for it. And then it becomes Time Magazine presents George versus Paul,
Right.
But it was stuff that I would have loved to have delved into, only because the focus is always so much on John and Paul.
Right.
And so this would have been at least given it a little bit more of its own voice and identity.
Mm-hmm. There's a quote here from an interview that George gave to a guy named John Hanrahan in 1986 that I think is kind of interesting, and I made note of it because I want to share it with you and get your thoughts on it. But sure. Again, it's a nice little window into their thinking at this point. So it's pre-anthology, it's post-John Lennon, it's around the time we know that there were lawsuits flying around. I don't think they'd quite happened yet. We know that when George and Ringo caught wind of Paul getting this favorable deal for re-signing with Capitol on their old Beatle royalties, it was reminiscent of him buying up stock in Northern Songs. Yeah. And whatever, if they're going to offer him that deal, sweeten the pot to come back, they're under no obligation to offer something to George and Ringo at that point. So I understand both why he would say yes and why they would be pissed off about it. But
exactly. And Paul actually spoke about that publicly, if you remember.
Uh-huh.
He said, I haven't been partners with these people in 15 years. I don't owe them a heads up about this. Right, they're not my partners anymore. If they want a better deal, they should get their lawyers to contact Capitol and get a better deal.
Yeah, here's Lee Eastman's card.
Right. And I think if I remember correctly, because it's been many years since I read that interview, but Paul basically said that whole all for one and one for all attitude, that's long gone. That doesn't apply here anymore.
Right.
And he was really surprised that they thought it did. But anyway, I'm sorry.
No, that's good. And I think that this particular dispute was what led to the absence of Paul from the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction.
Yep, absolutely. Which I did include in my bookazine. in the Time magazine book. Yes, that I made sure to include. That I felt was really important because it showed just how bitter things still were 17 years after the breakup.
Thank you very much. I don't have to say much because I'm the quiet Beatle. It is unfortunate Paul's not here because he was the one who had the speech in his pocket.
Are you saddened that Paul McCartney wasn't able to appear?
For him, it's a pity he missed it because he would have had a good time. And it was nice to see people saying, well, after all that we've done, that's all it was, really. Get the lads here, give them a pat on the back and give them the medal. And it's a shame he missed it because he contributed so much to it, but it didn't spoil our night. We still had fun without him.
Have you been able to have any reconciliation with Paul since that particular event?
Oh, he's okay, yeah. He's okay. He just was trying to use that situation for some personal motive that he had, and it just didn't work. But, we're long past all the squabbles now.
Even though they definitely, to me at least, seemed genuinely hurt by his absence.
Yeah.
At that moment. Not like, good, stay away, Paul. Anyway, this is from 86.
Yeah.
Question. Do you keep in contact with Paul and Ringo? George. Yeah. I've seen them both a lot, and they're well. I think our age, as well as we've mellowed out. There was a period of time where Paul and I didn't get on very well, but we're great friends now. And I think time slips away, and we realize that. It sort of comes back around, the cycle. I mean, I met Paul when I was 13 years old or 12 years old, at school. There was much more fun and good experiences that we shared than the bad ones. Question. Is there any chance that you might come back and do a record together in some form? I mean, everybody would like it, obviously. George. Well, the first stage seems to have happened, in as much as Paul and I are good friends now. The next stage is if we can pick up a couple of guitars and sing some old Buddy Holly tunes together. Who knows? We may be able to knock out a tune or two. If we can get that far, then what's to stop us getting in the studio together for one reason or another? It'd never be anything like some big reunion album or concert. I think we're past that stage. We're just thankful to be able to be friendly. If we could actually produce a tune or something, that's a nice little song, that would be enough. Why the ghost of Buddy Holly? Well, it's just that when we were kids and got our guitars, we were into all those early Elvis, Everly Brothers, Buddy Holly, and that's the kind of thing where if we were to get into a room, pick up a guitar, we're more likely to sing Peggy Sue than we are to sing Yesterday. So it's very interesting to hear his nostalgia and fondness at that period.
Yeah.
Because, and this is before his big wave of success with Cloud Nine and then the Wilburys. So he doesn't have to be gracious like, I'm the one riding high right now, and here's poor Paul, licking his wounds after Broad Street. But maybe that's implicit in there, is that Paul was falling into this fallow period, and George was still successful with handmade films at that point.
Right.
And he is being very conciliatory there.
Yeah, that didn't last, obviously.
No.
Because when Paul said virtually the same exact thing, what was it, within a year or two?
Yes.
George's response was, let sleeping dogs lie.
Uh-huh. And that's the thing. Even in 74, where he's using Willie Weeks as his shiv on Paul publicly, I don't know if it's the same interview or it's an interview certainly around that time, I'm ready for the Beatles to get back together and kick some doors down. Which guy are you today?
Right, right.
And I think probably both things were truthful for him as the words left his mouth.
Possibly. I mean, John certainly was inconsistent, to put it mildly.
Yeah.
Do you know if there's any truth to the story that Paul wanted George to play on Wanderlust?
Absolutely.
Okay, so that has been confirmed.
Yeah, uh-huh.
Okay.
And there's that great picture. It's a Polaroid that I think ended up in Linda's book of Polaroids that was published.
I've seen it.
Yeah, of George and Paul and George Martin.
Yes.
Yeah, right. And it's funny that my understanding is he explicitly wanted him for that track with George Martin producing, not George's greatest friend, but, I guess he could be conciliatory at that point. And he sort of steered them into contributing to all those years ago.
Right.
And then they ran out of time, and that was that. But that was the great meetup at that point. And I want to say, I think it was just before Ringo got married to Barbara Bach, which was April of 81. I think this might have been March of 81. So in that window where they're crossing paths anyway, naturally.
Okay.
So, yeah. But yeah, I mean, it's an interesting, we ran out of time were you that under deadline that it had to be done that day or else? I mean, it's interesting that they didn't follow up on it. Maybe Paul had a rethink, or maybe he was angling for some fence mending and one track was as good as another.
Right. Because there isn't a guitar solo on Wanderlust.
No, it's brass.
When I first heard that story, I was like, where would the guitar part have gone?
Right.
So that's why I was like, maybe this is like one of those BS, stories. But no, okay.
Apparently it's true. Or maybe George would only play if he could do answering guitar lines after each line of the song.
Yeah.
What do you got, George?
But there were some really weird things that happened even in the 90s between them.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah.
There was a point, this was after the anthology, where Paul thought everything was hunky-dory, and he kept reaching out to George, and George wasn't returning his calls.
Yeah, you're talking about where Paul was like publicly floating the idea of writing together?
He's done that so many times, I don't know if...
Well, it was the one that got the slapback from George, though it was the one where he goes, every time Paul wants to draw some publicity for his tour, he talks up a Beatle reunion.
Yeah, there was that, but I think this was later on. This would have been around 94, 95, and George just was not returning his calls. And I mean, this is what I read, and that Paul was bewildered about it. And there's a TV host, he was a TV host, and I think he's also been a comedian.
Fugelsang?
John Fugelsang, yes. Did you read this interview with John Fugelsang?
George's?
No. This was an interview that John Fugelsang did.
Okay.
He was the person being interviewed.
Oh, are you talking about the interview where he had interviewed Paul and he interviewed George, of course, and that was like his last TV interview?
Yes.
And the guy asks him about having interviewed two Beatles, and there was some quote about George. He said something. Fugelsang said to Paul, "Oh, we just had George down at the studio and he gave us 4 hours or something like that."
Yep.
Yeah.
And Paul's manager said, "Oh, he'll give you 4 hours, but he won't even return Paul's calls."
Yes.
And Fugelsang was like, "Leave me out of this." It's like, I was just trying to have a conversation. But he said that from his perspective, number one, George, I don't want to be inaccurate because it's been a while since I read the interview, but you know exactly what interview I'm talking about.
Yeah.
So I thought that was really interesting. And that Paul was so upset that, again, they aired this to an outsider,
Mm-hmm.
And again, something was clearly going on and Paul didn't know or understand what it was.
And neither do we. Yeah, we could speculate, but it's very interesting because there's this schizoid nature to it where he will talk about things are warm and we're all good now and we had to work through some things.
Right.
And then the next day, a lawyer slaps an injunction down on something or they're insulting. Well, it seems the invective mostly seems to come from George's side.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, I mean, that press release that George put out after the last anthology thing saying, that's it. There's no more Beatles stuff. Don't ask, nothing. And it was something that he put out on his own, not through Apple.
Right.
And I've always wondered if that was just, to shut Paul up.
Blue Moon of Kentucky. Well, Blue Moon. Well,
Just a short version.
Blue Moon. Shine on the one that's gonna let me blue.
In that same Fugelsang interview, he throws a question to George about Jeff Lynne working with Paul. Do you remember that? He goes, toward the very end of the interview, I'd been waiting because things were tense with him and Paul. So I was asking my last few questions. One of the last questions I threw in was, how do you feel about Jeff Lynne, who produced the Wilburys and produced George's records? I said, how do you feel about Jeff Lynne producing some tracks for Paul McCartney? And George just went, who? What? Who? And the whole room exploded in laughter. I mean, I think he's just being playful there, but
sure,
it's funny because it so aligns with the grumpy George, especially toward Paul persona, that people in following things were used to by that time.
I guess this was before Flaming Pie, right?
Yeah, that would have been the time they worked together, which was post-anthology.
Well, clearly it worked. I mean, clearly the relationship between Paul and Jeff Lynne worked because Paul had him produce for him.
Yeah.
And if, this is a big if George kind of got his nose bent out of shape that now Paul is working with Jeff Lynne, he's only got himself to blame.
Totally.
Because that was his pick.
Yeah. I wonder if he cornered Jeff Lynne about that and said, what are you doing work with that guy? But I don't think so. I mean, certainly you're not going to stop Jeff Lynne from jumping at the chance of working with a Beatle. That's been his fixation since the 60s.
Yeah.
I was thinking about something we'd said earlier, going back to India and the defensiveness manifest in Not Guilty. And if there was something that tainted India for George, or that he felt they blamed him for it going bad. Now, we do know that apparently George felt some resentment toward Paul for not taking it seriously enough. That, you're there for this reason, put down the guitar.
Right, exactly.
All three of them were guilty of turning it into a songwriting camp while they were there. I don't know if it's a bad thing. It's their next album. But you could do both. But apparently George felt they didn't take it seriously enough. And then Paul's out of there weeks before he and John are, of course. You see that little bit in the Get Back film.
Yes.
Where it surfaces that exchange between Paul and George. And it's clear a year after India that he's still harboring a particular take, not very favorable to Paul at least, but I think it's actually encompassing Paul and John, not getting out of it what you were supposed to get out of it.
Was that the bit where he said, if we were really ourselves?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So with John, we know that it's part of a pattern with him to set up things as the next thing. This is the answer. The whole description of the helicopter ride he managed to hijack with the Maharishi, thinking he'd be the one to get the answer to life
the answer
directly from him. And you see the pattern over and over again with different things he puts on a pedestal. And then once he becomes disillusioned, it's sort of a self-sabotaging behavior that he then burns it all to the ground.
Right.
As he's done over and over again. And I wonder what George's take was on that, because I don't know that there are any quotes that we've seen similar to what he expressed toward Paul, his resentment about Paul wanting to be a musician, be a Beatle in India when that was not the place for it. What do you think about John? John at least stuck with it longer, but then immediately burned it to the ground when he got back to New York. We made a mistake. Mm-hmm. Something that George felt moved to apologize directly to the Maharishi 4 years later. Again, it was Paul that stuck with TM and vegetarianism. If anything, he should have been George's buddy. And
exactly. Exactly.
Yeah. You were allies.
And Sexy Sadie was supposed to be Maharishi. And George had to talk him out of that. I mean, Paul didn't write a song called Maharishi. And like you said, he did stick with it. In fact, I know that he participated in that TM event a few years ago here in New York.
Yeah, the David Lynch Foundation.
The David Lynch Foundation thing.
Yeah, which Ringo too.
I think that's when I first found out that Paul was still... I thought that Paul had abandoned TM in 1968. So to find out that he was still involved after all these years, and that he had gone, I think, to visit the Maharishi again.
Yes.
Years later.
In Holland or something? I know that's where George went to apologize, and that was where that great quote from the Maharishi came, I could never be angry with angels, and just reduced George to a blubbering mess, apparently. Yeah.
It's a mystery. It's always going to be a mystery just why the bond between them was so strained. Again, the bond between him and John was strained as well, as we know from the last John interview, the Playboy interview, that John felt resentful towards George for not mentioning him more in I Need Mine.
Yeah. Which is a weird thing, because I pointed out in one of my books that John got like 11 mentions to Paul's 4 or something like that.
Right.
And it's silly. It wasn't that kind of book. It wasn't a real memoir.
Right.
But their strained relationships, you look at post-Beatles, they're all on Team Klein. And then 71, while John is not being super flattering, and word filters back to George about All Things Must Pass.
Right.
Yeah. He looks like an asthmatic Leon Russell on the cover, whatever the hell that is.
Yeah.
And then he, nonetheless, contributes to half the Imagine album, including How Do You Sleep?
Right.
And then the opportunity for reciprocation comes with the Bangladesh concert. John hems and haws. It leads George to think he's going to do it, but then Yoko's part of the package. George says no thanks, and that's it. And all that comes to a head in 74. Right. They have the backstage thing, Where Were You When I Needed You? And he rips the glasses off his head, and then they make peace, and John offers to come to the Madison Square show, and then that gets blown up when he decides he's not going to sign the documents on the day of when Paul's there, and he gets uninvited, And then they make peace again the next day when they have the wrap party, and then they actually are interviewed together that night on radio. So it's very volatile. And George has alluded to visiting John in Dakota in the next 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
And his quote was something like, I felt there was something he wanted to tell me. And
Right.
he couldn't. Yeah. And Pete Shotton says something very similar, too, during that same period. So it seems like George wanted to make the point that despite everything, and despite plenty of reasons for wanting to close the door on John, he doesn't. In fact, he said he felt the bond was still there when they looked into each other's eyes.
Mm-hmm.
With Paul, it's much more labored. It's like he will do the social things and be his friend and talk about, things are friendly now. But there's other quotes from him saying it's just like maybe an ex-wife or somebody you were friends with at work and now you're not, and you've moved in different directions and you wish them well, but some kind of stumbling block to keeping them from the three guys standing that shared this profound experience together. And I would think that the more distance you get from that, the more precious it would become to have those people in your life. And I think maybe only when he was terminally ill did he finally unconditionally reach that peace.
Yeah.
And Paul responds by not only sitting there on his deathbed and holding his hand, but giving him the secluded place off the map to transition out.
I think it might have been even earlier than that. I think it was the death of Linda.
That could be, yeah. And we're not talking, it's like, 4 years? And that was before the knife attack.
Yes. Yeah. Him coming to Linda's memorial service was, I think, as much of a grudge as George could hold to anybody, and as much as he might have been still nursing any kind of animosity towards Paul at that point. And he may not have been. I'm just speculating. But the guy's wife just died.
Right.
And he had to know to a certain extent the pain. I read recently, again, when I was working on my time book about Paul, is just what they went through. What Paul, Linda, the whole family went through during her battle with cancer. And I mean, you have to have a lump of coal in your chest for a heart. If that, especially the past that they had and the relationship, talking about George and Paul, for your heart not to go out to him. And if anything was going to bring them together and just say, you know what, let's just forget about all the nonsense. And I'm going to be there for you in your hour of need. It had to have been that.
That's a really good point, because we do know, and I think Paul was the one that said this, because George obviously wasn't positioned to, but I get the sense, I think it was very late in his life. It might have been that last deathbed meeting between them where George is saying to Paul, unburden yourself, forgive Yoko. You don't want to carry that around the rest of your life. Have you read that?
I read it. It's one of those things that I'm not sure. I have a hard time believing that he was that specific. That at the moment of his death, he's thinking about Yoko. You know what I mean? It's just like,
well, this would have been a couple weeks before, I think, when they were last having a conversation.
Well, no. I know what you're referring to. I think maybe it was more like unburden yourself of any grudges, and people interpreted that to mean Yoko. But I just have a hard time thinking he was specifically referring to her, unless she came up in conversation. But I don't know how much Paul is walking around with burning resentment towards Yoko at this point, or even at that point. I know that Yoko apparently was walking around with burning resentment towards Paul. Did you happen to read any of Jan Wenner's new book?
No, I haven't gotten to it yet.
Okay. I was flipping through it, and it basically, surprisingly, considering how much of a friend to Yoko he's been, how he kind of throws her under the bus in revealing that he had some kind words to say about Paul in Yoko's presence. I think Paul had just come out with a new album, or he had seen Paul in concert and paid Paul a compliment saying, yeah, I heard Paul's new album. It's really good. Or I just saw him in concert. And Yoko said, oh, he charmed you too, huh? Or he got to you too, or something like that.
Wow.
And so you can't even say something positive about Paul in Yoko's presence without her thinking that he hypnotized you,
Yeah. Wow.
I have a hard time believing that Paul's doing that towards Yoko. But
except, I was going to say, going back to the Linda memorial thing, you might have read this too in your research, that I guess knowing her time was coming to an end, Linda picked up the phone and made a personal entreaty to Yoko about allowing Paul to switch the credits on, at least yesterday. Yeah. And not only did she say no, but she then made that public remark about Paul being the Salieri to John's Mozart.
Oh, yeah.
Which is what got her cut off the invite list to the memorial.
And I agreed with that 100%. No, I believe me, I was following that very, very closely. I can't say I was as pissed off as Linda, but I was pretty pissed off.
What a small thing to say.
Yeah. And then not invited to the New York memorial for Linda, went to the press and tried to make herself out to be the victim there. Why wasn't I invited? But you don't know why you weren't invited? You say that and you're wondering why you weren't. Yeah, no, I knew about all of that. Yeah. But if it is true that that is what George said literally to Paul in the last meeting, try to forgive Yoko, I find that fascinating. I find it really interesting. And I also wonder, did George forgive Yoko?
I'm passing this on to you because I can't do it.
Exactly. Do it
if
for
anybody
both of
had
us.
plenty of reason to be, I mean, certainly Paul would have had his reasons, absolutely. But George is the one who at least outwardly expressed it throughout the tenure of the Beatles last year with Yoko present. Just the bad vibes, remark, quoting Dylan, as well as the digestive biscuit.
I was going to say the biscuit,
which John did not defend her over either.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You don't need a man's biscuit.
Right.
Well, I mean, Paul's the one who let them live with him for a while.
Absolutely. And he's the one defending them. Yeah. Like at every turn against his own interests. I've always found it very curious, the story of during the separation, Paul going to see Yoko and her telling him what John needs to do to get back together. Right. How does Paul have zero awareness that, they fix things, you're out of the picture? You sure you want this?
I suspect he probably had an inkling that might have been the case, but I think that Paul genuinely wanted what was best for John. And that's something that even Rolling Stone, of all sources, considering the anti-Paul bias that they had, where I think it was Michael Gilmore wrote that Paul loved John more than John loved Paul.
Yeah, that's an interesting observation, because clearly John was so consumed with his obsession for Paul. We have plenty of evidence. No, I mean, it's funny, the loudly he declaimed it about, I don't listen to Wings, I don't pay attention to Dylan or Rolling Stones. And you can totally call bullshit on that, knowing privately what was going on.
Exactly.
Yeah. And the fact that he's so vocal about it makes you think even more that the opposite is true. So I think that it's almost like George and John is the way John was with Paul, that once Paul was with Linda, once he'd made the mental break of the Beatles are over, yes, Paul wanted what was best for John, but he was never going to give John what John was looking back past a certain point. I think that was broken, and that was that. I think he would have loved to. I think that if John had given them that chance and been overt about it and not communicated in code, and perhaps with the brick wall that was Yoko between them, it just wasn't possible.
I mean, I know that Patty Harrison had written that George was very difficult for George to be around Paul, especially by the late 60s. Has Olivia, I'm a little fuzzy on that. Has Olivia been vocal at all in terms of George's feelings towards Paul?
I don't think she would dare, because even if they were negative, and I don't know that, I have no idea, maybe there is, but since they're all pals now and it is their joint interest to keep things, at least the facade of things, peaceable between them, because they're going to be crossing paths so often, every project and anniversary thing and all that stuff. But I wonder, going back to George, in terms of, you just reminded me of something, which is that clearly the relationship, for better or worse, between John and Yoko was profound, and between Paul and Linda. And we don't see the equivalent of that in George's life, do we? Unless you're talking about maybe a male friendship. He had a bit of a hero worship with Dylan. He had this friendship with Ringo as like old mates, but not like, I don't think it was anything profound. Or Clapton, a great friendship that went through so many travails, but he had friends. He didn't lack for friends.
Right.
But a serious lifelong commitment to any one person, certainly a wife. I don't get the sense that you certainly didn't have it with Patty, in terms of maybe they were connected, maybe they had a friendship after the divorce, but he didn't treat her very well. And we know that he didn't treat Olivia very well. especially somebody who puts themselves on a higher moral plane than us mere mortals. So I wonder if there was an incapability of that in him. And again, I don't want to play armchair shrink. It's just an observation that it's interesting that you don't see that. Even Ringo and Barbara Bach clearly have this soulmate relationship, and they've sustained it through all kinds of troubles.
Yep.
You don't see that with George. And I wonder if that is informing anything about his relations with his fellow Beatles, that maybe he didn't have the capability, or there was some problem with connecting with people and he suffered from that. I don't know.
That's a really interesting observation. I don't have anything that.
Yeah, I don't know either.
It's certainly something to mull over.
Yeah.
I wasn't aware. I mean, of the Beatles, probably I'm the least knowledgeable about probably Ringo, but George also to an extent. So I wasn't aware of the nature of his relationship with Olivia, other than he probably wasn't the most faithful husband.
Which it says it pretty explicitly in the documentary, the Scorsese thing.
Which I watched. I guess I must have.
George loved women. That whole exchange. Yeah, that was her sugarcoating way of saying. And there's plenty of documentation outside of Olivia of stuff he was doing. So it is just an interesting thing to me that was something that Paul and Linda managed to have and experience in their life in a way that George apparently didn't.
Sure.
And Olivia has said as much, that she felt replaceable, like a piece of furniture.
Wow. Okay. Was that in the Scorsese documentary?
I'm trying to remember where I read that. I seem to recall reading it in print and not hearing her say the words. But yeah, she's continuing to keep his flame alive.
Right.
In less of a over-the-top Yoko way with John, but the poetry book and stuff that she's been approving, projects coming out and stuff. So yeah, and it pains me to say that because, you don't want to be prying into people's personal lives and discussing it casually on a show like this. But damn it, these are historic figures.
Right.
And we're looking, I would do this if I was doing a Shakespeare podcast, but wanting to know what was going on with his life or anybody else. So that's why it's of unceasing interest to us.
Well, I have to say, one of the things that I did find truly heartwarming, and it was a very emotional experience for me that I still sometimes get choked up, is the concert for George, where Paul not only appeared, which I don't think Paul has ever appeared in any of the tribute concerts for John.
No, I don't think he has.
If they were organized by Yoko, the question is, was he invited?
Right.
But he never did. But he did come. Not only did he come, he had a major presence at the George concert, and his rendition of All Things Must Pass just really, like I said, I still get choked up occasionally when I listen to it.
I get that because that's a song with a history between those two and the Beatles. And I remember when I saw that for the first time thinking, wow, I wonder how many Beatle fans are hardcore enough to know the significance of doing this particular song.
Yeah.
You've probably seen the Clapton quote. He was talking about in rehearsals that Paul had to relearn the song.
Right.
Yeah. And that how he felt for Paul, especially when it was clear Paul had to have witnessed how deep and profound the relationships were that he had with all these other musicians that were gathered there to honor him.
Right.
In a way that he wasn't experiencing those last 20 odd years or whatever.
Right. And that these were people who were very protective of George and might have been sort of looking at Paul like, you're the guy he couldn't stand. What are you doing here, kind of thing. I remember Clapton's quote about that. I think he hit it out of the park.
Sure. And even the rendition of Something, which I guess he was doing on tour at that point.
Yes. Yeah.
And then they segue into the full band treatment with Clapton singing vocals. It's a great, great version. And when you think about how much Paul contributed to that particular song in the studio and with other George songs, I Mean Mine, While My Guitar Gently Weeps, that piano that he plays on it, he really knew how to enhance George's material. If he's telling him to his face the following year, well, your songs haven't been as good, but clearly whatever he thought, even if he really did believe that, he certainly helped make them as great as we view them and hear them today, for sure.
Exactly. Paul is all over Something.
Yeah.
See, here's the other thing. Sometimes these comments get misinterpreted. And there's a quote from George. It was interpreted as him saying that Paul's playing on Something was a little busy.
Yes. It's been misinterpreted as like it was a complaint, like he resented him for it or something.
Right. And yet, if you look at the quote, and it's been a little while since I have looked at it, but I remember reading it and saying, oh, that maybe at first when they were recording it, it got a little bit busy and that George got it to where he wanted it to be.
Yeah, right. That's the part that gets left out of the tellings of that anecdote. You're right.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
But still, it was a hell of a contribution to not only have Paul McCartney playing bass on your song, but to really put himself into it. I don't know. I'd like to think that if I were in George's place, I would really appreciate it. And I hope he did, because it is a beautiful song and Paul helped make it beautiful.
Yeah. And that's the thing is with John absent for that week or however long it was, the start of the July sessions, where him and Paul, George and Paul, are working together, knocking stuff out. You know, Here Comes the Sun, they track together. But John is actually playing piano on something, but Here Comes the Sun is one he's completely absent on.
Right.
And they're singing together. When Rock Band came out, you could hear the isolations of their vocal. Yeah. And then Paul singing the guitar solo during that bit. Yeah, it's beautiful. I mean, that's something that absolutely is moving to me. They work so great together. You would have loved to have seen that continue in some fashion, but their musical interactions was the very thing that George complained about, that he couldn't be in a band with him for. Why is that? You guys clearly showed that you were on the same page and focused and you can draw the best from each other. I get to where the don't play this on my song, George, can get wearisome, especially when you're blossoming as a creative force around that time.
And you want to contribute.
Yeah, yeah.
You are a Beatle and you're being told you can't be on this Beatles track.
Right. A blind spot.
Sure, for sure. Yeah, I've been thinking about it a lot because when I was in McCartney mode, when I was working on that book, I was like reflecting on the whole Hey Jude incident. And I was like thinking, couldn't Paul have like put 5 minutes aside and thought about, here's a space in the song where George can kind of flourish. George could put some kind of thing in there. Was he so, and I guess the answer is yes, but the question was going to be, was he so wrapped up in his own little world that he couldn't see how George might react to, I don't want you on this song.
Right. No, that's the thing that he clearly couldn't see. And at the same time, he's trying to keep these guys engaged. We see at least going back to the White Album sessions, Honey Pie, a song that they single out for particular disdain as one of his fruity granny songs, turns the guitar solo over to John, who shines on it. And I think that their disdain might be a bit overstated because, as we know, John was a fan of Bing Crosby and a lot of soft, non-rock and roll, pre-rock and roll stuff.
Yeah.
A person who hates that kind of music isn't going to deliver something that perfect, right? in Get Back, not only does Paul give the guitar solo to John for the title track, but even George, like, here, for you, Blue, why don't you play the slide part on this? And I'll just play my acoustic. So they recognize when they can get John engaged by giving him something key to do, that maybe Paul was less making a priority out of engaging George similarly.
Right. For sure.
Yeah.
And here's the other thing. During the Get Back sessions, when John is heavily getting into heroin, which I believe started during the White Album sessions, where John is kind of disengaging and he's being preoccupied with Yoko. Again, and Paul, who is always considered to be the most savvy of the Beatles and certainly the most political in terms of the interband politics and so forth.
Right.
That would have been, with John kind of receding, it would have been the perfect opportunity, because for Paul to get all the support that he needed, sort of like, to use a Survivor term, could have formed an alliance with George.
Right. And maybe as attractive as that would be, because clearly they worked very well together musically, it would have pleased George to be found useful by one of the senior partners.
Exactly.
But would that have been the action that Paul feared would push John out of the band? It's like, okay, you guys don't need me. You know, he makes that curious statement I believe in the Get Back. If it's not in the film, it's certainly around that time. I would die for Yoko, but I wouldn't die for any of you, or something like that.
Yeah. If I have to choose. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
What a curious thing. Who in life says that about their spouses, no matter how much they love them? What a weird thing to say. I've always kind of wondered that if George conversely, during that time, seeing John push Paul aside for Yoko. And George, of course, has great disdain for her from day one, maybe not recognizing the implications that John is taking Yoko and filling the space in his life that Paul once did. Instead, he sees just that Paul's being pushed away. Mm-hmm. Maybe he's angling for, now this is my moment to shine with John. He's going to take me up as a collaborator, me, the other anti-establishment Beatle, which they'd been to that point, and not getting it. Or come 69, the Get Back sessions, where he's got this simmering grievance with Yoko's ascendancy and John's withdrawal. Mm-hmm. And maybe seeing Paul as senior Beatle and ostensible partner with John as being the one who maybe can shake him to create this situation in a way that George can't. And he's not doing it because Paul is treading on eggshells around John when it comes to the Yoko situation, and recognizing there is a problem there, but if I voice it, he's just going to leave.
Right.
Is George harboring a resentment of Paul for not stepping up and handling it? You want to run this band. Why aren't you solving this problem? I don't know. That's just another thing that was floating in my head, is like, why else would he be so openly disdainful of Paul in a way that he's not of John?
Right. And again, I mean, I wonder if it ever occurred to Paul to sort of lean on George a bit more. Certainly, it would have made George feel more wanted, useful, and kept him engaged, and addressed the problem that don't do it in a way that antagonizes John so that he feels like he has no choice but to stand his ground and leave, but do it in a point where stuff's getting done, you know, and you're producing quality material, and somebody else in the band is now feeling more validated. My understanding is that after George quit during the Get It B sessions.
I love it.
We should call it that.
Yeah. Trademark.
That it was either Neil Aspinall or Derek Taylor, somebody in the inner circle went to George and said, come back. Don't let Paul shoulder the burden of this all on his own. And that was one of the things that pulled George back into the fold.
Yeah, that was Derek. And I believe he talks about that in 50 Years Adrift. It's somewhere not readily accessible, but it's been quoted enough to where I know that's exactly what you're talking about there. Is that, that was ultimately what helped push him back into the fold.
And so that does indicate that there still was maybe a brotherly love, or at least a certain enough degree of compassion to tip the scales, like, okay, I won't let Paul endure this all on his own.
Yeah. So it is interesting, if you think about, they seem to be aligned very closely, at least through the Revolver sessions. And Paul helps him tremendously with Taxman, and he gets an unprecedented 3 tracks, including the opening track on Revolver. That's a high watermark.
Yeah.
And then he backs away from it. He goes to India. Suddenly, rock and roll is very small. This Beatle thing, I'm not a Beatle anymore, as he says on the plane out of San Francisco. So he's kind of strung along to that point, not really until pushed after Only a Northern Song gets kind of shelved, and it's like, okay, you can do better than that. Gets challenged and comes up with Within You, Without You.
Yeah. I like Only a Northern Song a lot.
Me too. Yeah, it's fun. It's very different. It's musically very colorful, but I get to where if you got an album that at that point you're still thinking Strawberry Fields and Penny Lane are going to be on it, you want to raise your game a little bit for this. But
sure.
But it's almost, in terms of Beatle careerism, self-sabotaging for him to not build on. I guess what I was going to say is that Paul, as of the Revolver sessions, is coming awfully close to looking at George as an equal, at least somebody worthy of that much album space and contributions from him to enhance his material in very prominent roles. And apparently John accepted it as well. So anyway, my point being, he was the one that backed away. If he hadn't, if he stayed like, what are we going to do next, guys? Sgt. Pepper, I'm fully on board, and what can I do to help? Instead, he's like, oh, why don't you take the lead, Paul? That's the kind of disposition they have. Because he discovers TM, I want to say early in 67 is when that becomes insinuated into their world, but he's already been to India. He's already going down the Hare Krishna path and looking sort of for this antidote to what Beatlemania has done to him.
Okay, that's all well and good.
But
the bottom line is that he had 3 tracks on Revolver. Okay. And yet for the next what was it, 30 years, he bitched about the fact that he was only being allotted 2 songs per album.
Right.
So that to me has always been a mystery.
Mm-hmm.
And what you're suggesting is that he pulled back. So then why was he bitching about only getting 2 tracks after 1967?
And what is it he says at the tape meeting where Paul tells him to his face, your songs haven't been as good, and that's a myth.
Right.
And then he says something like, up until now, I haven't been pushing as hard, which is exactly what you're saying. And now he is. Now, we do know that John has expressed resentment in 1969 in the interviews he does, I think from the Abbey Road period onward, while they're still in this sort of limbo, determining whether they're going to go forward as a group or not. And he says something, he's belly aching to the point of, well, I don't want to spend 6 months on an album if I only got 2 tracks on it, or something where he very much is not wanting to be a contributor to songs he doesn't originate. That he doesn't want to put the energy into it. So to me, it sounds like he's explicitly speaking to George, because even with Paul, he's still clearly not only helping with input, but even has designs on something Paul came up with, like an Oh Darling. It's like, why don't you let me sing that? I could do better. That to me, he's conditionally still interested in Beatling, but maybe less so with George.
Right. Well, let me ask you this, because you are an authority on Revolver. How did George get 3 tracks on that album? How did that come about?
The understanding is that John sort of spent himself right out of the gate, starting with Tomorrow Never Knows, and then everything he had in hand to that point, I'm Only Sleeping, and Dr. Robert, and Andrew Bird Can Sing, and Rain. They tracked everything he had in his pocket like right away. And he was struggling to come up with another song for the album. And as we know now, he contributed more to Yellow Submarine than really has commonly been believed. Yes, Paul had the hook and the vision, but the verses, and there's contemporaneous interviews where they'd speak to that. But he himself, I think in the Playboy interview, said he considered it a Paul song. So he didn't claim any kind of ownership of that. But it was George that then, in the absence of John material, gets another track onto the album, but then goes out to Weybridge to help John pull She Said into presentable shape. He said it was like 3 separate segments that its exact words was, that was a real weld to get that put together into a whole. And then he come back to the studio. They got 1 day to track it. Paul walks out, whether he played bass or not. We've got a little bit more of a clue in the new set where you can hear, was it track 7 or take 17 or something, where Paul's still there. And so maybe he plays bass and walked out after that, but we never doubted he was there that day. We just know that he wasn't there at the conclusion of the day. But in any event, I believe that was how George got a 3rd song on the album, was that John didn't have anything ready until the very last minute. He got that last track done with George's help. And again, if there was ever a period where they could have really started to see George as an equal, maybe that was it, because here he is. Basically, She Said might be properly credited as Lennon Harrison. The first time since Cry for a Shadow.
So it wasn't a matter of Paul basically deciding to shut George down after Revolver.
Well, George withdrew. But we do know from his own accounts later, we hear him telling Ringo that, isn't it a pity he had in 66, where that means in time for Revolver or end of the year. But he had it that year, and he said John didn't like it, and that's why they didn't do it. We know Art of Dying dates to 66.
Right.
To me, that's probably post-Revolver, and maybe later in the year when he's getting into the Indian philosophy and start thinking in terms of reincarnation and things like that. That might have been inspired by that. I don't know for certain, but that's my suspicion. But whatever you think of those songs, if you're going to be Paul McCartney saying, well, they weren't as good as our songs at that point, I'm sure there's 6 examples of lesser Lennon-McCartney songs I can point to from the last 2 years of the band that George's songs shine above, but it's all subjective.
So George withdrawing being into part of the mix, it's fascinating to think of what those next albums would have been like if he hadn't.
Right. And, John had sort of, when he starts drifting into acid, that's about the point. I find it very striking that Revolver is like exactly the half-life of the Beatles band. 63 to 66, Please Me to Revolver, and then 3 years after that. That's where Paul's ascendancy and John's checking out start to happen. And he's immersed in acid. That's what he's doing. And Paul's taking the lead. Then Brian dies. And then really Paul starts taking the lead. And not until, I don't find it a coincidence that they go to Rishikesh, and at least principally, they're off the self-medicating. Although we know apparently they were able to sneak some things into the ashram, but certainly he was off of LSD.
Right.
That suddenly, relatively clean, his receptors are open and all these songs are flowing out of John again, as he himself claimed that was the strongest batch of songs in forever. What comes out of him in Rishikesh, and amazing stuff. It's hard to argue with him. So that's where he becomes at least more engaged again as an artist. Now, everybody looks at the White Album differently. It's one of these funhouse mirror things that, that's the start of their solo careers there. Or is it them getting back to being a band and playing as a band, nowhere more so than on the songs John brings in, where they're really playing as a band. Yeah, the Happiness is a Warm Gun and I'm So Tired and Everybody's Got Something to Hide and Sexy Sadie. These are all great, fantastic band performances. So I hear something different other than you can see hints of solo tastes from that album. But for John to say, well, it's me and Sidemen and Paul and Sidemen and George, I don't quite hear it that way.
Well, we know Paul didn't like that album.
Yeah, and that's interesting, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
I know in George Martin, it should have been a single album.
Right. Well, and Paul, during the Get Back sessions, which, and this Peter Jackson did include, it's just a little bit. If you're not really paying full attention, it goes right past you. But Paul makes a disparaging remark about the White Album. Basically says he doesn't want to go through again what they went through with the Beatles. He was still
it's funny that they always refer to it as the Beatles, not the White Album.
Yeah. But he was using the White Album as an example of what not to do this time.
Right. And that seems to be, it does pop up over and over again on the Nagras that they describe it as unpleasant, at least the creation period, if not the final result. So, it was the Tension album. I forget which one of them called it that.
Paul.
Yeah, okay. So, and we know Emmerich quits and Ringo quits and George Martin takes off unannounced. But, I've talked to people who were there also, Chris Thomas and Kevin Harrington, and Ken Scott has talked about it, that it's like anything. Yeah, there were moments where it was awful and a slog and tension-filled and open warfare and things like that. They put a ton of pressure on themselves. They're running a business, absent their manager, and recording 30 songs.
Yeah.
So it was incredibly challenging and daunting all at once. The romantic personal travails going on at the time, the breakdowns of relationships. Derek Taylor's comment, I've never hated anybody as much as I hated Paul McCartney that summer.
Yep.
George even had made the comment about Paul's heavy-handed manner in running Apple, telling employees, you really shit.
I don't know. Mr. Wentworth just told me to come in here and say that there was trouble at the mill, that's all. I didn't expect a kind of Spanish Inquisition. Nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition.
To me, that's a symptom and not a cause. That's what was going on post-India, that they're being most unlike themselves to that point. So we know it's changed. There's no Brian, and they've put this unholy burden on themselves.
Well, wasn't it also another beef that George had against Paul and also against John, too, was the whole thing, the announcement about Apple and what Apple was going to be?
What was he specifically complaining about?
Kind of like the Statue of Liberty. This was never supposed to be, come, everybody come and bring your talents. And George was like, that's not what this was supposed to be. And I don't think he thought they should have formed Apple in the first place.
As a record label?
As anything, but certainly as a record label where they were going to open up the doors and basically do a talent bake-off. I think that was something that he was surprised by when John and Paul announced it. And he was like, what are you guys doing?
That's interesting. So he must have been one of the few people that saw it as naive
and just not what they had talked about, and potential for a disaster is my understanding.
That's very interesting. I know that he was off at the Cannes Film Festival at Wonderwall at the time they were doing that stuff with Ringo. So he would have seen it from afar.
Exactly.
But it's interesting that even though he's got a seat at the table at that point, and Yoko hasn't worked her way in, that as 1/4 of that post Brian, that he wouldn't have had more of a say, or he would have been surprised at the direction it was taking.
Yeah, I'm almost 100% sure that he was surprised by the direction that it was taking, and that he thought that either that his understanding was it was just going to be a tax shelter,
right,
or it was just going to be their record label, and maybe like bring in a few friends, but the whole announcement, like, if you've got talent, Well, no matter where you're from, come on over and we're going to listen to your tapes. And he thought that was just insanity.
This man's now driving a Bentley that we paid for.
Right.
Yeah. That's funny. It does seem to be a side of George that was practical in a way that they weren't.
Sure.
But also there's a reflexive side to piss on their parade at any moment, too.
Yeah.
So, yeah, both purposes are served.
Yeah. I mean, it's one of the things that, because I'm such a Paul fan, Paul's my favorite. And there's an anecdote that I think Paul made a comment to Denny Lane. This was right after John had died, and they were in the studio working on Rain Clouds, I guess it was. And it was Denny Lane and George Martin and Paul. And Paul said something to the effect of,
"You can be replaced, Chicky baby."
No. This was like within hours of John dying.
Oh, okay.
And Paul had said something to the effect of, "I'm never going to ever be in a position again where I lose somebody and I don't really reconnect with them. I'm never going to let anybody die on me again without mending fences." I'm paraphrasing terribly, but that was the basic gist. And the fact that despite all of the animosity, aggravation, bitterness, resentment, lingering bad feelings, whatever, he was there for George, and that George was there for him in his hour of need. And I was quite touched by that.
Yeah, that's interesting. I had always been under the impression that Paul had said something along the lines of, "Well, I'm glad me and John ended at a good point because George didn't get that."
Right. Yeah, exactly. And I don't know what the context was of why Paul said that. Maybe he was
saying that he was glad that it did happen, but from now on he's going to take it seriously. Sure.
Exactly. That, I'm just glad that I managed to, mend fences with John so that there was nothing left to resolve. And fortunately, that did not happen with George, that they were able to really come together, no pun intended, especially in those last few years.
Yeah. I mean, and I guess maybe it took terminal illness to prod him in that way, because I'm thinking, well, what if George and Ringo had been in a plane crash on the way to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction, very much on the outs with them at that moment? So,
exactly.
Yeah. Well, who among us?
It's definitely a fascinating topic just because they had been so close. And it just seemed like of all the relationships that were, if not broken, really stretched to the breaking point within the Beatles, that the one between Paul and George never 100% fully recovered. So anytime there's like good moments between them, those are like the real moments of interest, because they seem to be a little bit more rare than the others. Paul never threw George out of his house that we know of.
Right. Yeah, and I don't know that absent something surfacing that's like a smoking gun of their relationship, I have no idea if we'll ever get to the bottom of it. And I've actually made entreaties to people in the psychological profession to come take a look at this. What do you make of this, this dynamic? Because there's probably some kind of precedent for this. There's certain things that are fixed that we know. The age difference and the dynamic of power within that group.
Yeah.
And the way they dealt with fame, the way they connected with other relationships. And as mentioned, George seemed to bond with men rather easily, but with women, it was a different story in terms of at least a lifelong commitment. So, what does all that mean? There's got to be something there. His natural introversion and being thrust into a life that he wouldn't necessarily have chosen for himself. He just wanted to be in a band, as he said. He said that after John was killed. All I ever wanted to do was be in a band.
And I will say, and again, this is at the risk of playing armchair psychiatrist, but the fact of the matter is that Paul and George were the friends first.
Yeah.
And Paul brings George into the band, and they both, to a certain extent, idolize John. Both to a certain extent. But at some point, Paul gets elevated. And I think that may be where the whole dynamic really started, is that George sees Paul kind of getting the promotion. You know, they both came in as interns, and Paul gets the promotion, and George kind of like stays the intern.
Right. Yeah. That is as good an explanation of the dynamic as anything, you know, and maybe that's how it felt to George. I always thought it was interesting that he's the third of 3 boys in the Harrison family.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, he would have been used to that dynamic of being the baby, as well as the least taken seriously.
Sure.
And so the Beatles would have felt very familiar to him, at least subconsciously.
Mm-hmm.
But we don't know if he railed against his older brothers the way, or picked one of them, you know, the way he did in the Beatles. I don't know.
Yeah. I can imagine you have to deal with that in your family, but what's supposed to be your outlet, you know, the thing that's supposed to bring you pleasure, and to find yourself in the same dynamic that you don't want to be in your other life, I get to that being a real source of
your relationship by choice hasn't panned out the way you thought it would.
Exactly. Yeah. A source of disappointment rather than pleasure.
Right. At least we've got, for what it's worth, the sense that Danny and Stella and Julian and they see themselves as cousins and family and get along quite well.
And that's hopeful for the future when they're basically running the affairs, that maybe we'll get some of that great stuff that we know is out there that's still being withheld from us.
Yeah. And there'll be parity between partners. They're not going to perpetuate the dynamic of the pecking order.
Exactly.
Something About the Beatles. Created and hosted by Robert Rodriguez. Sponsored by BetterHelp. Go to betterhelp.com/satbeat for 10% off your first month. Executive producer Rick Way. Title song by The Corgis.